Hey guys! So today, you and I are going to talk about programming libraries. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how do you evaluate which programming libraries to use in your projects? I usually, first and foremost, have the opinion that less is more. That is my Yagni type of thing, like you're not going to need it, keep it simple, stupid, and so forth and so forth. So to make that super clear, first and foremost, guys, so I'm absolutely not of the opinion that there is no benefit in having third-party libraries and things like that. On the contrary, I think there are quite a lot of libraries that are almost essential for you to be able to do effective work and so forth and so forth. The thing you should dissuade people from, however, is to forget sort of that the libraries themselves are not the goal. And quite a lot of software developers, they go around and looking for libraries that can do all these sorts of various things for them. But the problem with that approach is that every time you add a library, you increase the surface area. One part for security reasons, like more libraries means wider area in terms of like attack vectors and stuff like that. But it's also a question of maintaining them, and of course the most important thing that I argue for is that the potential complexity of your system goes up, or at least the source code. And one thing that is really common to see is that you have your favorite set of libraries that you could never ever imagine working without them. And now you go to a project where they might use something else, or maybe you invest on behalf of the project in the libraries that you really care about. Like an extreme example of this is developers who are so convinced that, say, reactive programming or functional programming or something like that, that is like a must-have. Without that, you could not write serious software without it, right? And then they do that in a stack that maybe uses other conventions or things that are more norms within the specific community. And now a bunch of other developers join, and they don't really know how these libraries work. And now what you've done is that you've picked a bunch of libraries that may suit your specific workflow at the cost, or so at the expense of the company and onboarding other coworkers and things like that. This, I would go as far as to say that it's not the top thing that people fight over in PRs and projects and so forth, but it's top 5. For sure it's top 5, like people having opinions about what libraries or things like that, for sure. And so that's why I am an advocate of using the standard libraries, or if you're doing browser work, like try to keep closer to the standards and so forth. It's similar, the semantics behind it, or like the heart and soul of it, at least when I make the argument, comes from that it's the same, like it's the criticism that I give to people who use a lot of abstractions or create like DSLs or stuff like that, where if you use just the native language or the platform that has been built, then you know that anybody who's ever like mastered, say, Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, it doesn't matter, like if you have someone who knows that language, that is the lowest abstraction. In other words, we all start at the same pace, same point here, right? Because that part we all will know together. If you add a lot of libraries, you are increasing the likelihood that someone knows something that somebody else doesn't. And so in other words, if you want to make sure that everybody can always feel comfortable in the code base, the best thing is if you use either just the standard libraries or something that is so well established that it's basically, it could have been basically part of the standard libraries, right? And that is how I pick my libraries. I pick my libraries based on, like, I only add certain party dependencies for things where I know that this will be like a breaking type of thing, right? It will be like a deal breaker if it's not there. It will be a game changer, like it will completely have an impact on like the whole work process. If we talk front end, for example, I would argue that unless we're making like a static website, which is not that common, a SPA framework of some sort would be appropriate. And I know that the most common ones will be the best bet here. The reason why I know that is because for the most part you're not looking for like niched things, so forth and so forth. In other words, the more experimental I get and the more I try out stuff that may not be as mainstream as some other stuff, the more risk I introduce to the project. And so what I try to do is that I try to really consider that, because the value of having something that is stable and you know sort of that everybody's going to be able to learn it, that has immense value. So if you're going to sort of step away from that, it's almost a little bit like writing more complicated code or creating more complexity on your system, in your system. And you know what I've said before, guys, complexity over time, that is the hardest thing in software. No discussion, at least if you ask me. There's no discussion whatsoever to be there. I completely, like, I will go as far as I will go out and stick my neck out and say it is more complex, it's harder than naming things, and it's harder than caching, both of them. It is the thing that will dictate how your system does at all, like, because you have so many people with various backgrounds, people come, people go, and so forth and so forth, but the code remains. And so to make sure that that code is in the best state it can be forever and ever, that is really, really tricky. But you increase your chances of that happening if the code is very simple. In other words, if you start adding a lot of libraries, you take a risk with that. And so you have to really know what you're doing. You have to really think about it and say, all right, will this extra complexity really be worth it? Is it critical? As I've said, if I'm building a static website, then I do not need an SPA framework. I'm adding complexity that I don't need. If I'm building something more serious than that, then I'm taking a risk by going another way. So very recently, for example, I had a bit of an epiphany. So when React and Angular and all that stuff sort of came along, I had a certain thoughts about, in this case, front-end development. And then I started looking into web components and Polymer back in the day, and then I thought to myself, and I've actually said this in a video, I think, that I wish that Polymer had been the thing that became big instead of, say, Angular and React, because of this thing I was saying, like, it's closer to the standard web browser. But frankly speaking, at the time, I felt that web components, and even to this day, and I'll tell you why, it's something that might be a bit of a risk. Even though it's closer to the standard, it's a bit of a risky move for me to bet on it, due to the fact that I know that the vast majority of, like, all the college students, all the juniors and so forth, they are accustomed to working with Angular, React, Vue, etc., right? And so from a risk perspective, it is more risky to use something that might be more stable in terms of web standards, as opposed to a third-party library that is so established that it's actually increasing, like, it would be basically it's a reverse type of situation. The third-party libraries are so standardized that it introduces learning curves to not use them. But for me, who's sort of open to it in my own products and so forth, I've realized very recently that, well, now web components have gotten to a point where all the things that I foresee as being like an issue or so forth are gone. So if you ask me, at the very least, we've gotten to a point now where I would use web components myself for everything. But as I said, that is my personal opinion, because I have had, you know, a few looks around on, like, how to use web components, tried it out, done stuff. It's sort of like a functional programmer or like anybody like that, right? You have done the extra work now and you've checked some stuff out and you know that it's good and so forth. And now comes the real question. Is it like a good idea to take what you believe now and put that into the project and, like, add a library, or say, like, for me it's even worse. Like, imagine me, who's I have 16 or 18 teams or something like that, which, like, where they all basically more or less are expected to follow my technical leadership. So imagine if I sat down and I said, we're all going to use web components now for everything. That would be a pretty risky move on my part, to say that to an entire department of people, like hundreds of developers, and say that that's what we're going to go with. And then, you know, the company will have to pay for, like, the process of, like, making sure that everybody knows everything, the migration cost, like, all that sort of stuff, right? It's the same deal when you pick your stack, I argue. Try to think about it maturely. Try to think about it as investments. And so you have stable investments that you know that it's basically required to have this library, because if you don't have it, you are not going to be able to write your test, or you're not going to be able to deliver, or the juniors are going to have a hard time learning stuff or stuff like that. It causes problems, right? And try to avoid picking up anything that does not fall into that category, because you do need third-party libraries to a certain degree. But remember, every time you add one, you increase the risk of not being able to manage your complexity over time. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I pick my libraries is based on that I know that practically every product has the same sort of needs in terms of, very obvious things like if it's back and I need a web framework of some sort to do routing and so forth and so forth. I need some way to connect to databases or things like that. I need some way of doing logging, testing, like these common things. That a good rule of thumb, guys, is that if there is a library that is basically like doing the thing across the entire stack, like testing is a good example, where there's no language out there's no web stack whatsoever that doesn't have a testing framework. So if you need to pick a testing framework, the most obvious thing would be that regardless of language, you would go and look at, okay, which one are the highest ranked ones, which if you don't know any better, right? With experience, you learn more and more stuff. That's the trickiest part in JavaScript land, for example. I like to say that the most senior software developers, the most senior developers in JavaScript land, they are the people who know which libraries to pick, because there's so many that it can be tricky to figure that out. But at the very least, you should be able to bet on the stuff that is most mainstream and the most stable, right? And that is what I try to give you as advice, as doing by default. Only pick the stuff that you really, really need. Pick the stuff that is most in like the popular, boring, obvious stuff, and avoid a little bit the riskier moves, because as I said, it might be that little library or third-party thing that you're going to add or so is super, super important, or it makes something really, really nice and so forth. But you always have to weigh the risk here. What are you going to gain from adding it? Is it really going to make a lot of difference versus the cost of maintaining it, increased security considerations, stuff like that? And that's usually not the thing that gets people convinced, in my opinion. But the most important thing, I argue, is will all the other developers who you are working with right now and in the future feel like, yeah, this was a really good move on your behalf to add that into the code base? Or would they kind of go, we could have done without this probably? If that is the case, don't add it. Have a great day.